So people are really aware of the costs. And when you have someone like Pete Hegseth going and very passionately demanding more money, people are quite annoyed about it.
We're going to talk US news, another busy week there, and reporter Harriet Alexander joins us this evening. Good evening, Harriet.
Hi, Geoff.
Hi, good to have you with us. We're going to start with the story about the Trump administration imposing new tariffs of at least 10% on imports from 60 trading partners, and they've accused them of failing to tackle forced labour. The measures take effect today and target economies that account for the majority of US imports, including the UK, Canada, China, Mexico and the EU. US Trade Representative Jameson Greer outlined the administration's reasoning in an interview with CNN.
We're the leaders on this issue, but if I'm shipping into a third country, even a place like Australia, where maybe they don't have a robust law like this, they might accept goods made with forced labor from China or Malaysia or wherever, and then our goods exported from the U.S. have to compete with that. That's not fair to our workers. It's not fair to our unions.
Harriet, the cynical among us might think that this is just them scouring the US statute books and laws, and they found a loophole that allows them to basically reintroduce roughly the same tariffs that they did earlier. Am I being too cynical?
No, I think that's actually kind of quite a fair assessment, Geoff, because this all stems from essentially from a Supreme Court ruling back in February, which was when they said that Donald Trump essentially didn't have the power to impose the tariffs that he had already put in place. So since then, they've just been quite creative about finding ways around this, about finding new ways to put in place these tariffs that they want. So from February, it was a flat 10% levy, and that was scheduled to run for 150 days. That has just expired, and they now have these new tariffs that are in place between 10 and 12.5%. And these essentially are, according to the government, that's because of forced labour. But yes, you're absolutely right that a lot of people say that it's just the Trump administration trying to find creative ways to do what they wanted to in the first place.
I mean, how much kind of control does Trump have of this administration? Because I guess what you've got to do is you've got to get politicians to go in front of cameras and act like they genuinely believe that this policy will somehow have a quantitative effect on tackling the issue of forced labour. How sincere do the people talking to the press seem?
Well, I think, you've got the hardcore people at the heart of this, like Jameson Greer and Peter Navarro, who are real hawks on this issue. And they genuinely believe that the US has been taken advantage of for far too long, particularly by China. So for them, it's quite easy, really, to go out there and use whatever means are necessary to justify it. So I think, their consciences are quite clear. But already we've seen some of the Democrats pushing back against this. Ron Wyden, a senator for Oregon, he said, if the US is so concerned about forced labor, why don't we start actually enforcing our own restrictions against them? Because the US has had that on its own statutes for 100 years, but there's been very patchy enforcement of that. So people are certainly raising their eyebrows about it, but there are some hardliners who really feel that this is important and that it needs to be done by whatever means necessary.
OK, we're going to talk about Secretary of War Pete Hegseth now. He has said the conflict with Iran has so far cost $37.5 billion as he appealed to lawmakers for additional funding. Appearing before the Senate Appropriations Committee on Tuesday, Hegseth also became embroiled in a heated exchange with Michigan Senator Gary Peters.
You show some leadership and stand up to your fellow Democrats who won't fund the troops, who stand and play partisan politics while you don't give us the money. You want to stand up here and talk about the troops? You won't show any political courage to actually fund our department because you have Trump derangement syndrome and can't actually commit to anything meaningful. So I put this on you, Senator.
Secretary Hegseth, you have trillions, you have over $1 trillion. You're asking for $1.5 trillion. It's not a question of money. It's a question of leadership and understanding what it takes to actually win.
Political cowardice of Democrats who won't fund the troops.
I mean, it's quite a binary way of looking at it, but that's a very Pete Hegseth way of looking at it. I suppose my first question, Harriet, is one thing that I think Times listeners might be interested in, is how exercised are people about the money that's being spent there. We don't get the sense that it's because it's not a ground invasion or an occupation. It's not, there isn't pushback in the same way there was with Iraq or even more so Vietnam. What is the level of public opposition and how exercised is it?
Yeah, I think you're right, that, people certainly in DC are quite exercised about this. They're quite angry about it. I think nationwide, people are just a bit resigned. They're frustrated. They're frustrated, I think, at their representatives for not doing more to really push back against this, because it's costing a huge amount of money. And actually, Geoff, you and I talked last week about how there was concerns that the United States was actually running out of some of its stockpiles of weapons, that it wasn't able to replace them quickly enough. And that was really having knock-on effects about US security and about what the US could do around the world in places like Ukraine. So people are worried about the costs, and it comes at a time when, there is rising prices across the board, when inflation is still much, much higher than the officials would like it. It's 3.5% in goods year on year for June, and that's well above the 2% target that they wanted. Of course, gas prices is a big issue here in the US, and those are ticking up. They've gone up above $4 a gallon again. So people are really aware of the costs. And when you have someone like Pete Hegseth going and very passionately demanding more money, people are quite annoyed about it. But at the same time, there's not a lot that they can do. As you say, they're not taking to the streets. People are frustrated, but it's sort of a throwing your hands up in despair and waiting for a change of government rather than actively, shouting about it, I think.
I mean, people listening to that Hegseth clip would have heard a person, certainly instinctively, felt like a person who was on the defensive, a person that was under pressure and that was lashing out in the other direction. One of the criticisms of him is that he's just got a bit of lack of vision when it comes to actually winning the war. Is the issue of further funding is that people don't think that additional funds would necessarily materially change the situation on the ground?
I think so. I think that's part of it, Geoff, but also a big part of it is that, this war is very unpopular. It's always been unpopular. People don't really know what it's for. And Donald Trump has been very canny in the way that he's not gone to Congress to ask for the usual authorization, which is what many people would have expected him to do. If you remember back in February when this all began, he said that it was going to take 4 to 6 weeks. Well, we're now months and months down the road. And frankly, there's not really any end in sight. The Houthis are piling in, aren't they, in Yemen, making the situation much more complicated. We did have those deals that now seem to be collapsing. The US is launching strikes all over the place again. And, it's pretty intense and pretty, there's no end in sight. The one thing to mention, Geoff, is that there's some suggestion that Benjamin Netanyahu could be in DC next week. We don't know for sure, but that's what some reports are saying. That could be quite a key moment to see if there's any sort of movement on this issue.
OK, we're going to talk now about Infantino, because it's been nearly a week since the World Cup ended. But President Trump is considering backing Gianni Infantino to head the UN, because the FIFA president is respected by everybody around the world. That's a quote. I didn't say that. Now, Trump is thought to support a move for Infantino to become the UN Secretary General to replace Antonio Guterres after his retirement in December. When asked about this proposed appointment, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said that Trump and Infantino can't get off the phone with each other.
They speak quite frequently, and the president has a lot of respect for Gianni and what he has done with FIFA. As we all just saw, the World Cup was a tremendous success here at home. It not only was hugely beneficial to our businesses and our local economies across the country, but I think it showed that America is the greatest country on earth, and the president is grateful to Gianni for all of the efforts that he had to make that dream a reality here in the United States.
Harry, I'm trying to work out what's going on with the bromance with Gianni Infantino. Obviously, the World Cup, or as Caroline Leavitt puts it, the World Cup, was in the US. Is it Trump respects power, he loves power? Has he belatedly realised that soccer is hugely powerful and hugely lucrative. Is that what's created this connection between the two men?
Yes, I think that's a pretty shrewd analysis of it. And I think Infantino, for his part, realized that having Trump on side was going to make his job a lot easier, and that there was a lot of money to be made by everyone for this. He, of course, is very intent on filling FIFA's coffers, and he's done that, with the advertising breaks, with the hydration breaks, with all of that, with the halftime show. So he knew that, having Donald Trump on side would really make his life a lot easier. And of course, he flattered him, didn't he, right from the very beginning with the Peace Prize that he awarded him. And this is just the kind of the latest installment of this, Geoff. And it's actually quite funny how it came about. It was an Italian-American businessman named Paolo Zampoli. He's actually a former modeling scout who introduced Melania Trump to her future husband. And he was instrumental in finding her work in the US. So he's always been on the sidelines, but he spoke to the New York Post, and it was him who said, Trump thinks that Infantino would make a great UN Secretary General to replace Guterres, who steps down in December. I mean, the big problem with this, of course, is that he has no experience at all that would be relevant for this. And also there's the rule in the UN that it rotates by continent, by region. So we've had Kofi Annan from Africa, then we had Ban Ki-moon from Asia, then Guterres from Europe. So now it should go to the Caribbean, Latin America, and there's some pretty qualified people whose names are being bandied about. Former president of Chile, those type of people, and of course Infantino is Swiss, so that's not going to work, and there will be vetoes from the other permanent members of the Security Council. So it's all rather pie in the sky, but it's quite entertaining and a sign of how much Trump really loves Infantino.
I'm glad you clarified that Infantino is Swiss. There were some people thinking he might be half Argentinian. I don't know where that came from. Harriet Alexander, a US journalist, thanks very much for joining us on Friday Night with Norcott.